It's the Misfits.
Hey everyone, I am back.
He's back! Yay!
Yes, so it's glad to be back in the studio, Andrew.
Yes, we've had people very concerned that I kicked you off or something for failing the 12 Days of Misfits too often.
Didn't get a perfect score, got sent away to Misfits camp.
Yes, but he's back. He passed his camp. He's back. He is both of us have had extremely crazy, chaotic schedules and events and all sorts of different stuff going on since he was here I guess you were here. This isn't your 2024 debut. This is just season 4 debut. Because you and I did Wisdom back in January or February, whenever it was.
It was
a long
cold.
time ago. It was cold. It's not anymore. But yeah, this isn't your 2024 debut, but it is season 4 debut because both of us have been running around like chickens with our heads cut off for the past like 6 months.
Yeah,
not full year.
Now I've got a baby on the way here soon.
Yes, he does. Which
got school master's program I'm almost done with. Working on house projects, traveling more, so just all the added fun things.
Which happy late Father's Day. It's Father's Day while we're recording this.
Yeah.
It will be Father's Day
a week,
2 days ago, something like that when you're listening to this. But happy Father's Day to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Today we are, like I said, it's his season 4 debut, but it's also the return. It's not just the return of Brandon, it's the return of the accidental series that we just can't get away from. We are still going to keep going and walking through the fruits of the Spirit. And so today, in honor of Brandon's return, and because there's no way to do it without grouping them together, we're actually doing 2 fruits of the Spirit.
2-for-1 special.
It's a 2-for-1 special at the fruit market today. So we are working on trying to go through and define and look at 2 fruits of the Spirit that always get grouped together, whether by accident or intention. And that's part of what we're going to talk about, is that they have to be grouped together, but they also need to make sure that we know that they're not actually the same thing. So we are talking about goodness and kindness today. We're going to start with goodness because goodness is much more complicated because, like we said, we all know what it means, but we don't want to say it because we know we're not going to be able to say it right. So we're going to go ahead, and we don't ever say anything right, so we're going to go ahead and just mess it up for everybody right off the bat. So in honor of Brandon being back, we're headed to Webster's.
Perfect.
And this time is one of the few times that we have the same basic definition and in the Greek, which the concept of goodness in English is the quality of being morally good or virtuous. So virtue, morals, Aesop's fables, all those sort of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Greek goes one step further in that there's a second side of goodness, which is about generosity. We don't hear about the generosity side of goodness.
No, because we want to be very much tied up to our own wealth or resources. And so we struggle of being able to share that resource specifically.
Well, and sharing wealth is always called what? Within our society, the idea of us just sharing the wealth.
I was like, there could be lots of things.
Right. I'm going with the word that we're described with all the time would be Marxism, communism,
Gotcha.
all the, part of the reason why we don't look at this in that way is because of the fact that we live in capitalist land. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Don't ask me to even provide you the boots.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Don't just give you food. I'll just show you how to go do it yourself and then not give you any of the resources to do it. But me showing you how to do it is still me being good.
You forgot. You can learn all this for $3.99.
That's right. Speaking of, patreon.com/ministry. Now, the Jewish concept of goodness goes even one step further into mitzvah, which mitzvah is a Jewish word that all of us are actually familiar with, right? What happens with Jewish children when they turn 12 or 13 or 15?
There's the bar mitzvah.
Or
bas
the
mitzvah.
bat mitzvah, right? We know this word, but what does it actually mean? Anybody know?
I'm going to say celebration.
No. Mitzvah is actually the word for commandment.
Mm.
So the bar mitzvah is the idea of the fact that you are finally now coming under the covenant.
Mm.
You are now at the age to where you are coming under the covenant. You are coming under the commandments. So specifically, it's a commandment tied to the community. So those of you that have been following along Kingdom on the Road, this is part of what we walked through when we were going through Leviticus last month, is that most of the laws were not actually dealing with an idea of sin as much as a harm to the community, which again is not how we ever talk about the Old Testament law. But it was dealing with the community, which is also why all the sacrifices, everybody was on a level playing field. It didn't matter necessarily what you brought. There were different things for different levels of income. It didn't matter who you were. Everybody in Leviticus is listed as the offerer. The one that had sinned and was bringing the offering was no longer the tribal leader. He was no longer a priest. He was no longer a peasant. He was the offerer. Everybody was on a level playing field, and everybody knew what was going on in support of the person being reconciled first to God and then to the community. Not how we talk about these things.
No.
Why not? Because Paul, when he's writing the fruits of the Spirit, is writing to a Galatian audience, which is Gentile and Greek. Why are not generosity when we talk about goodness in our churches?
Would it be because of the government at that time of control? I don't know.
Well, it's not necessarily why Paul was talking about it. It's more of why are we not talking about it?
Okay.
So in our context, we kind of already have dealt with it a little bit. But this is part of where we get into the problem when we talk about things like why is the church not following Matthew 19 or Acts 4 and 5 and selling all we have and giving to the poor. Why are we more likely to hear answers from many pastors, because we get this all the time when we bring this up online, the idea that stuff was just for them and not for us?
Yeah. I think if you talk to majority of people potentially in the church, they will say, well, yeah, maybe you don't need to sell everything, but then it's where your heart is at,
right?
Of with those possessions. So you don't need to sell everything, but if your heart is in the space where somebody, your neighbor, regardless of who it is, comes up to you and is like, hey, I need this, you're willing to give it up because you recognize it's not yours. But that's so hard to contextualize.
Why is it hard to contextualize?
Because I think in our flesh nature, which we always talk about, of it lists the we'll call it the fruits of the flesh first,
right?
Then the fruits of the Spirit, where truly I think a lot of things are always rooted in pride. And so truly our pride and our greed and our self-preservation.
I wouldn't say pride. I would say idolatry, right? Because we're putting ourselves as God in the situation. I get to decide whether or not you deserve this stuff or not.
Yeah, which I would argue is pride,
right? But it goes a step further, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, pride, there are a lot of different definitions for pride, right? Sometimes pride is a good thing. Pride in your kids is a good thing, right? No problem with that. The idea, even Paul talks about boasting in the Lord, right?
Yeah.
Idolatry suddenly shifts the idea of where our pride is at, because now our pride is affecting the mitzvahs, the commandments.
Mm-hmm.
How we interact with our community is affected by the pride that we have, not so much because we are too proud, but because of the fact that we now are trying to be like God. and not in a good way. Good again. Not in a way that is actually biblical as far as being Christ-like.
Yeah, it's more in a controlling sense.
It's in control, which pride is about power. Control is about power, but it's a softer version that we sometimes think is more acceptable.
Yeah.
The bigger question beyond that, because again, we also know that part of the problem is, again, we've got the capitalist Christianity stuff as to why we don't like to talk about it. But why is it that Paul, a Jew who understands the Jewish concept of the goodness of God, why is it that we don't read in to our definition of goodness the idea of the commandments to community? Does that make sense?
No,
I'll try to reword it here one more time. So you already highlighted in the first part of what you were saying, the fact that this is why it's a fruit of the Spirit, right?
Mhm.
Our natural desire is to make it about us.
Yeah.
Not about other people. But the understanding of goodness in a Jewish concept, which is what Paul is writing out of, is that goodness is defined by the way that we approach our communities. Specifically, the laws towards communities. So things like loving your neighbor, things like taking care of the foreigner, things like providing for the poor and the orphan and the widow, all these sort of things, as far as the way that we approach our community and reminding ourselves that we are attached to it. But when we talk about goodness in terms of the fruit of the Spirit, it's all just about, well, what are we showing? It's not about what the community sees. It's about what we are showing. Why?
Well, I'm going to say part of it is because it's our personal relationship with Christ and how the Holy Spirit is working through us to develop and cultivate each of these fruits of the Spirit. Again, this is not an exclusive thing of like, oh, I'm not gifted in this area of goodness.
Right, which I have heard that before.
Yeah, like, no, this is you might not be exuding goodness, but that doesn't mean that.
And we struggle with different ones, right?
Yes.
I mean, that is not what we're saying, that everybody should be able to do this right away, but it's different than the gifts. The gifts are given as the Spirit desires and as the Spirit wills for the building up of the body, of the community.
Yes.
The fruits of the Spirit are accessible to anybody that is actively allowing the Spirit to work. This is the renewing of the mind stuff again, which is what you were alluding to in the first part, is that if the spirit of the flesh is saying it's all about me and the way that I spend my money and my resources, then it's going to take a non-fleshly push to get me beyond that.
Yeah.
It's the same thing when we start talking about the community side of this as well, though. Because our desire, this is part of why I corrected you idolatry from pride in the first one, is this is the one that I would say is definitely more of a pride than it is an idolatry. Even though, like we said, they go hand in hand, just like goodness and kindness go hand in hand.
Yeah.
This one is one that is affected much more about it should be all about me and not about anybody else. Mm-hmm. Because generosity can become an idol as well, right?
Yeah, if that's all you're striving after to get, again, it's usually what you get in return. That's why we were talking about.
It's about
the kindness at the beginning of we should do it without expecting anything in return. But yeah, that's where generosity, if that's your goal and focus, on the outside, it could be like, wow, this person's a really, really great person, good person. They're doing all these things for the community. They donate here. You always see them serving. They're on this podcast talking about this, but it's like, well, they want all this fame and recognition, whatever it is.
And this is part of the hard thing as well, because we run into this all the time. People claiming that Misfits is doing that, right? Mm-hmm. Well, you guys only talk about the poor. You guys don't actually do anything. You guys do all this stuff just to build a platform and then charge people on Patreon for Bible study material. You guys do this, and this. So you don't actually believe this. So if you don't believe it, then obviously it's not real. So I don't have to either. That's not what we're talking about, though, is it?
No.
What we're talking about is the fact that a fruit of the Spirit, a sign that the Spirit is working, is in the way that we are doing these sort of things. Because if we are showing a spiritual goodness, then it's not about us. It is about the community that we are involved in, whether that's local, whether that's online, whether it's a combination of the two, whether it's our families, whether it's our extended families, whether it's our church family, whether it's the non-church people we work with, regardless, goodness will follow, which is one of the Proverbs, right?
Yeah. And I'm actually going to take it back all the way to the beginning.
Uh-oh.
Because I like doing this here. And we talk about
Be
this.
kind, rewind.
Well, I wasn't going to say that, but sure. I'll do a,
And this is the fun
gotta
thing
add a little
is that
remix in here.
this is going to be the first time I think where people are going to actually, we're going to get a generation gap, because I have a feeling there are people that listen to us that have no idea what we mean by rewind.
True. I didn't think of, I don't know. It's still on Spotify. You can hit rewind 10 seconds, right?
But rewind 10 seconds and Be Kind Rewind, a store that only has one remaining store open and it's only for nostalgia value.
That's right.
I don't think we're going to get the same, unless you're a Jack Black fan, I don't think we're going to get the same kind of response that we would have even 15 years ago.
Probably not. But
anyway back to the beginning.
Yes. So with that, we go back to Genesis in the beginning, where God is going through creation and creating it. And at the end of each day, I'll say here, of when God created the stars and darkness and light, God saw it and it was good. And then he creates living creatures and animals. And God saw that and it was good. And then he gets to creating man and woman. And at the end of that, there on the seventh day, God sees everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, which I love to see. And so one of the things that you and I have talked about specifically is Imago Dei, being made in the image of God. And that is why we should love our neighbor. And so I think that is also going back to the very beginning of, well, where does this goodness come from?
Right.
It comes from our being made in God's image, and him speaking that to every individual. Everything that he's made is good. And again, at the end, God says it's very good. And so I think when we talk about our neighbors and the community and the discipleship and loving everybody that's even a non-believer, it's because we're all made in God's image. And God said it was good. So who am I to discredit God's creation?
And this is where the fun part comes in, is that word good and the idea of mitzvah good are actually somewhat separate.
All right, break it down.
Because the word that we've got in Genesis 1 actually means beauty more than good. So we're not talking about morality. We're talking about appearance. We're talking about taste is another place that this kind of word shows up. We're talking about peace, being agreeable, which is more than morality.
Yeah.
This idea actually is one that I would say probably is the best example of how goodness and kindness are actually supposed to be intertwined. Is that it is beauty and peace and agreement more than it is moral virtue, which is part of where we get into the trouble of things, right?
Yeah.
Because this is part of the argument you have, really no matter what part of Christianity you are in, some form of this argument is going to show up as far as, well, if God created everything and it was good and there was no sin, then how could Adam and Eve had sin nature? Because everything was good, so it was moral and virtuous. Well, one, moral and virtue is not actually what is being described in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
But if goodness is what is described in creation and goodness is ascribed to God, then it makes sense why Eve would think that. Why would the tree not be good? It was beneficial food is what it talks about in Genesis 3. It was pleasing to the eye. It was beautiful. And the idea that Satan implants in Genesis 3 is that you'll be what?
Like God.
Like God. That's a good thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're called to as Christians, is we should be Christ-like. Eve was not actively trying to sin against God. Eve was not seeking out her own pride, but she was violating a commandment that was given by God for the community. Don't eat of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
But she violated the commandment in search of something beautiful. God is beauty. His creation is beautiful. And in doing so, she broke the moral code as well. This is part of where it gets complicated because we don't think of things in these sort of terms in a Western mindset.
No.
Within most Eastern cultures, this is actually pretty easy to grasp because the difference between beauty and moral goodness, and both things being considered good and effective and needed, is much easier to grasp in those kind of cultures. But then you get to us. And the idea of goodness is much more about what are you doing for you. Being good is much more defined by what are you doing for me,
Mm-hmm.
than it is what are you doing for all of us in community. But when we look at goodness in light of creation, it does help us with going into kindness as well. So you defined it much more in terms of already a much more publicly based mindset than most people do, as far as the way that we treat other people, right?
Yeah.
Without expecting anything in return is what the goal is. Even though we know in reality, when we talk about kindness, that's not actually what we're talking
That's
about.
not the-
Let's tell you what we're thinking about. But this is the annoying thing, is that, again, Webster's is being ridiculous in that they're defining the worst possible way for us, because they say it is the act of being friendly, which is what we were just talking about.
If they're being too kind.
But it's also the act of being generous
Mm.
and considerate. Now, considerate and generous can have multiple different definitions as well, right?
Yeah.
Like we said before, generosity can be twisted. Consideration can be twisted into what can I get out of this, even though I am being kind to you.
Yeah.
It's still all about me, even when I am focused on you. The Greek idea is benevolent benefit to others. I like that one a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Benevolent benefit is you are loving a person in a way that benefits them. So I'm out of the picture now. An example of the difference would be the ideas in churches. If you think you're not guilty of this, then I'll direct you to looking at where some of your benevolent thing is going, or the way that your congregation talks about it. Somebody comes in saying, I need $5 in order to meet my rent this month. And you say, oh, we don't hand out cash, but here's a gift card to McDonald's. You can claim you're being generous and showing charity to a person, providing them with food, but you did not meet the need of the person that was there.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, well, I don't know what they're going to use the money for, means that your focus is still on that money being yours rather than the money being God's, or the money being theirs once it's given to them. A benevolent benefit to others would be, here is the $5. There you go.
Yeah.
This is what you have asked for, saying this is what will meet the need. So this is what I am giving you so that you can meet the need. Major difference in concepts, major difference in practice, even though we like to lump them together and thinking they're the same thing.
Yeah. And I think in the worldly context, we also like confuse maybe nice
Yes.
and kindness, being kind. And I think on the surface, nice is just % of like, you're a nice person or you're a good person. Again, that kindness is more of the acting upon the
Nice would be what we define as kindness within Webster's. Kindness itself would be the Greek idea.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But again, the Jewish concept goes a step further. The word is chesed, and some people should recognize this word just even from listening to Misfits, because this is one of the words that Joash and I broke down when he was on Talking Biblical Justice. This word actually is a loving kindness, imaginative kindness, and purpose. A little bit of a different concept here.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the same for being generous and everything, but a loving kindness is a kindness that goes beyond just what a person has asked for into how can I meet your need and beyond. This is part of why Jesus is able to say in Matthew 5 that the law actually is saying, if your brother asks you for a tunic, give him two.
Yeah.
This is what chesed is. They ask for one, I give them two, even if now I haven't. Courageous kindness, a courageous love. Okay, this be actually what is highlighted in the Good Samaritan, right?
Mm-hmm. What
What is it that the two men that passed by are not showing? It's this, chesed, however it's actually supposed to be pronounced. Whereas the Good Samaritan goes above and beyond, even at his own personal risk,
Yeah.
even to somebody that is not like him. It is showing of the love of God. Sometimes this is also just defined as mercy. It is a loving act of kindness towards somebody, regardless of if we think they deserve it or not. And it now goes back to what you already talked about in Genesis 1, and that it is a love of mercy towards humanity because they are beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
made image of God, good. All of things wrapped up together. That's not how we talk about kindness.
I was reading recently, and one of the things it talks about is when you go fishing, what do you put at the end of the hook? You put a worm. You put something there that's going to be attractive for the fish. You don't put your favorite food there, so you don't put a pizza or a burger when you go fishing, because more than likely the fish isn't going to eat that, or it's not going to catch them.
Although
And
burger and pepperoni does work well. But,
that might work. Cheesecake probably won't.
Yeah.
What it's talking about is we put into the hook that are to catch others, to attractive for others, that there's something in it for you. So whether you go to Salvation Army and donate, or wanting to do the dishes this morning, typically in the back of your mind you're thinking, what's in it for me in the end? And so it's very hard for us to step outside that fleshly desire, no matter the small things of doing the dishes, to step and say, of how can I serve my wife today? Or how can I serve my kids or my community or my family? Because we always want to revert back to what's in it for me, or what am I going to get out of it by doing X, Y, or Z.
And the bigger piece that you put in there again is this idea of one, this is why we were saying it's fruit of the Spirit. But the other thing that comes in there is you were talking about the fact it's an active idea in your own mind of it's not about what I'm getting, it's how can I serve this person?
Yeah.
Ideally, what we actually see happening is that we don't have to be actively thinking about it in that manner anymore. This comes easier for some people than others. And this is where we're going to go and now sound like we don't know what we're talking about back earlier. For some people, they are gifted to be able to do kind of stuff without any. The gift of charity is real. Gift of hospitality is it's worded.
Yeah.
I will give, perfect example, even though they deny that this is the case, we know that this is very much the case. The Brownings.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody knows Karen. We talked about her husband a little bit when she was on back in January as well. I would say hospitality is something that, even if it at first was hard, is not something that they necessarily have to think about.
Yeah.
That's something that is just part of them. And everybody recognizes immediately that it's not a natural thing.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody recognizes that this is a spiritual gifting of theirs. That is part of the difference between goodness and kindness and what we are talking about here and how it's normally defined out in the world, is that you are able to tell that this is not a natural thing. It can't be taught. It has to be renewed in us. That's part of why all of this stuff actually matters. Goodness and kindness are always tied together throughout the Bible, because you cannot show goodness without kindness, and you cannot show kindness without goodness.
Mhm.
They have to come together.
Yeah.
But they also have to come together with a lot of the other fruits of the Spirit as well, right? We just talked about the fact that kindness is attached to love. A lot of the reason we don't talk about it this way is that we assume all of that stuff is under love, right?
Mhm.
Some of the stuff we
It's
talked
the catch-all.
it's the catch-all. Some of the stuff that we talked about under goodness would be stuff that we would file under things like self-control, right? Because it's all about moral and virtue, and that's always defined under self-control, never under any of the others. Goodness in terms of I'm good, and the way that we talk about it would be something that we're like, oh, well, that's part of joy, even though that's not at all what we're dealing with. We're talking about goodness as part of the beauty that God created us with. It's not about joy. It's about the fact that we are representing our Creator in the way that He created us. They're tied together. We talked about this in the Galatians Bible study, again, patreon.com. We talked about this in the Galatians study in terms of the fact that all of the fruit of the Spirit, it's a cocktail. It's not individual fruits.
Mhm.
Everything should be present. Part of the reason for that is that a lot of these have to have each other in order for them to actually play out in a way that we know it is of the Spirit and not somebody just trying to act more goodly.
Yeah. And that's why I like in Ephesians chapter 2, and starting in verse 8 through verse 10, it kind of ties everything together and I'll read it here. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own thing. It is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast, as we've talked about. And then really the key part here, for we are his workmanship, as we talked about, created in Christ Jesus for good works, created for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So God's already prepared our step. And again, our alignment should be to be in step with the Spirit to carry out the good things that he's called us to.
Well, and I would start you even further on, but we don't have time within the chapter, because I think the bigger thing is look at verse 4. What's verse 4 say?
But God, being rich in mercy,
because of
great love,
does what?
Loves us.
No, read verse 5.
I was like, that was 4. Even though we're dead, made us alive in Christ Jesus. By grace, you've been saved.
But God. So for those that haven't read Ephesians 2, the first 3 verses are basically what we already said we is before the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were dead in the trespasses of your sins. You were living according to the ways of the world. You were under control of the power of the air. And we lived in our fleshly desires. But God.
Mm-hmm.
Rich in chesed, mercy. Rich in mitzvah, loving kindness. Goodness. Made us what? Alive.
Made us alive, yeah.
Renewed us. That's what we're dealing with. That's why the fruit of the Spirit do matter way more than just Sunday school and VBS. Because they are what show the world that we are alive and not in the trespasses of our sin. Because they are showing the characteristics of the God that saved us.
Mm-hmm.
God is rich in mercy, goodness, kindness. God loves us, kindness, goodness. God is more than generous with us, mercy, goodness, kindness. All these words keep showing up because this is who God is. And this is why we see it all throughout Scripture as far as goodness and kindness tied together, is that this is part of how we know who God is. This is what God requires of us as well. We already said goodness is part of how we are defined as creation. We see it throughout the law. Goodness and kindness are a major part of it because the commandments are attached to community and attached to kindness and attached to goodness, both of them. We see it throughout the prophets. Most of the prophets were yelling at the people because they were not doing either of those things, right? They were not showing mercy where they should be showing mercy.
Yeah.
They were not being generous. They were not taking care of those in their communities. They were not loving other people. They were not loving God. All these different things all were tied up into why the prophets had to keep going out and saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over. We see it in the Psalms. Like I said, there are multiple Psalms where we see the idea of goodness and mercy, or kindness and love, or good and kind, all put together. The Psalms and the Proverbs both list those things together quite frequently throughout. The big one is Micah 6:8, though. What's Micah 6:8, Brandon? See if you can get it off the top of your head.
I don't have that one off the top of my head.
He has told you, O man, what is good, to seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. He has shown you, O man, what is mitzvah, good. The commandments, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the command to be good, to be moral and virtuous and generous, and to love your community. He's already told you what you need to do with that. To seek out justice, which is tashaki, good, righteousness, justice. All of those things are all tied together. If you are not actively seeking out justice in your community, if you are not seeking the community's righteousness and the way that we see in the law, which is about the community being on equal footing together in communion with God, then you are not seeking out anything that God has already said is good. To love chesed, mercy, kindness, loving kindness for other people, benefiting them and not ourselves, and benefiting the community more than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
If you are not doing that, you are not doing what God has said is good. And then, like we have been saying over and over, walking humbly with God, because it's not about us. It's not about our pride. It's not about our own idolatry. It's about who God is.
Yeah.
Goodness, mercy, kindness, loving kindness, all the different words that we've used to describe these two terms are what show up in Micah 6:8 as far as this is what God requires of us. That only comes from that last part, walking humbly with God. What does that look like for us as modern day believers to walk humbly with God? It is a allowing of the renewing of the mind.
It's that daily dying to self.
Daily dying to self, which is, again, part of where we all see it. The great commandments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which are to
love God and love other people.
And love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor more than yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Love God. How do we love God? Well, he's already shown us what is good. We seek justice, we love mercy, and we walk humbly with him. How do we love our neighbor? Well, what does Jesus say? In Luke 10, when he asked the man who started the whole problem by saying everybody's favorite verse in today's age of who is my neighbor, Jesus responds with the parable, and he asked him, which one of these men loved his neighbor? And he said, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus responds with, go and do likewise.
Mm-hmm.
How do you love God? By going and doing likewise. How do you love your neighbor? By going and doing likewise, which is, again, mercy, goodness, mercy, kindness. These two things cannot be separated out from the way that we as Christians are acting, because they are intrinsically tied to everything that God has done for us. So, again, this is part of why we know it's a fruit of the Spirit. This is not something we do naturally. Kindness is putting others' needs ahead of our own. Kindness is also putting others' interests ahead of our own, which is the same thing that Paul also says in Philippians chapter 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the verse that we use, at least in online settings. This is the verse that we end up going back to more than anything else. This is the verse that completely dismantles Christian nationalism. This is the verse that also dismantles capitalist Christianity. This is the verse that also dismantles the idea that the best way to love somebody is to shout, repent, or perish at them. All these sort of things are tied to this idea that if we are considering others more highly than ourselves and putting others' interests first, then we are going to be showing them goodness and kindness, because goodness is about what? Mercy, generosity, and a generosity that is for the person and not for us.
Mm-hmm.
Is about following the commandments of God to love others. And it is going to show kindness in that we are going to be putting them first.
Yeah. I love what our pastor Kenny Thomas talked about last week in his sermon. He was talking about taste and see that the Lord is good. We kind of talked about that just
Which it would be
briefly.
which word for good? Is it mitzvah, or is it the word that we have in Genesis 1?
The one in Genesis 1.
Because the Lord is beautiful.
Yes.
Taste and see that. But keep going. Yes.
Yeah, I was like, anyways, what he talked about is we can't tell other people to taste and see that the Lord is good if we haven't tasted and seen
Right.
that the Lord is good ourselves. So the example analogy he gave which was great, which was of his son telling everyone, hey, you need to eat your vegetables because it's good for you. And he genuinely, as a 6-year-old, like cares about people and wants them to eat vegetables, but for himself, vegetables are a no-go. And so I think that sometimes I love that example because it's sometimes what we do with Christianity of this is good, or this is what you should be doing. This is what you should be doing in your community here. But it's harder sometimes for us to also apply it and live by it and have it, us taste and see that the Lord is good for other people, because it's what you're talking about here. It's almost that invitation to come in and see what we're doing in a way through God or because of God.
Doing these things in tandem takes hypocrisy away. Ultimately, that's part of what this does, because if we are actively seeking what God has already told us is good, and Micah 6, then we are going to be able to eventually allow ourselves humbly walking with God, allow the Spirit to renew us to the way that some of these different areas that we are the most hypocritical are going to cease, at least in the way that we interact with others. It may not in our own hearts, but at least in the way that we are dealing with other people, they will start to cease. This is, Caleb and the veggies is a fun one. We'll go with a not so fun one that more people, at least a lot of people that I know listen to us, are going to unfortunately recognize very quickly. This is the problem that we have with the way that the LGBT community is talked about in our churches, is that they are labeled as always being groomers, always being pedophiles, always being this. So be good and don't do those things. And so just come back and be with us, while ignoring how many pastors and deacons and ministry leaders are actively actually grooming people within their own churches, and either ignoring it or shoving under the rug or covering up or turning it into some kind of spiritual pious idea, and that this person is being attacked, and so this person is evil, so throw out the accuser.
Yeah.
That is not loving. That is not kind. That is not good. That is actively going against all of those different things. It is hypocrisy in the greatest sense, because you are sinning against the community, first of all. So we are violating all of the Jewish principles that we already looked at, even though we want to claim that we're upholding the law. We violated all of it. We are not loving God because we are not seeing the victim as being beautiful in God's sight. We are not even loving the actual abuser because we still are not seeing them as beautiful in God's sight and wanting to call them to accountability. We are not doing any of these sort of things, while we are constantly also calling people that have not actually done anything to us as doing the very things that we are trying to hide ourselves.
Yeah.
That is the opposite of what we see here. And in fact, it's actually what we see listed in Galatians 5 as being the fruits of the flesh. It is divisive. It is idolatry. It is, like, I don't even know what all the different words we could use for it are. There are so many that fit that. But again, we don't necessarily look at it as being a violation of the fruit of the Spirit side of things, because we don't put goodness and kindness together outside of the kindergarten mindset that we started with at the beginning.
Yeah. And again, going back to the knowing God's goodness, of a lot of times people put that, we'll say, condemnation on somebody that doesn't know God's goodness yet. And
Right.
so we're holding people to God's standard as believers that they don't know about God's goodness. And so we're getting to the condemnation part already.
We're in
where-
Ephesians
like,
2 again, right?
yeah, we're like, wait, we just jumped a step. We're not showing them about God's love and different things. We just went straight to the condemnation, and we're holding people accountable for, I'll say, on like different playing fields almost.
Yeah, this is why we started with Ephesians 2. But God is the only reason we do this, not by our own works, so that no man can boast. God is the one doing this. This is part of the problem we have when we look at the idea of morality as the definition for goodness. Morality in human terms changes, it shifts. It's always been this way, that it has never been this way. That is the one thing that is constant, is it's not constant, right?
Yeah.
The morality of a situation in terms of philosophic ideas and social ideas and all that stuff is constantly shifting, and it's supposed to. It is supposed to, because the community's needs are different. This is, again, the one of the few places where the Western ideas coming out of the Greeks for society is actually a good one, is this idea of the fact that what the Greeks said as far as what goodness looks like is a generosity, and it's a generosity that benefits the other person more than it benefits us. It's not about what we want to give, it's about what is being asked of us. Society is supposed to do this. But a Christian is operating differently, because our kingdom is not here. Morality, God has already shown us what is good, what is moral, what is virtuous. It is to seek out justice, it is to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. That's it. Which is why love God, love neighbor are the only two things that Jesus says everything hinges on.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is what we are doing in Micah 6. We are loving God and we are loving our neighbor. The idea that we as Christians are supposed to make the world more moral makes zero sense, because we are either saying that we think our morality is perfect in terms of a sociological idea of morality, and it is fully denying that morality in terms of goodness and kindness only can come from the Spirit working within an individual and not from anything exterior.
Yeah.
That's why all this stuff actually matters. That's, again, part of why we are very much always going to tell you Christian nations cannot exist. You can't legislate morality, because morality only actually comes from the Spirit working on a person. And it's got to be a person that's willing to let the Spirit work, that is walking humbly with God and saying, renew my mind.
Yeah. You can have all the laws in place, but
and if the laws are in place, and this is part of, the blog that we released, it's been about a year now, actually, as far as the hypothetical Christian island, as far as what happens if an island in the Pacific just appears and it's inhabited only by 1,000 Christians. Wouldn't that be a Christian nation automatically? And so I expand, like, okay, so what would that actually look like then? A Christian nation, a nation that is just 1,000 people that all are believers and all in fellowship together living in society, what would that look like? It would mean there's no military. Why would there be a need for military? There's no police. Why would there be a need for law enforcement?
Mm-hmm.
There's no income. Why is there a need for income? Everybody is supposed to be doing what we just talked about as far as what goodness and mercy look like. There would be no need for need for military, because there's no need for war. We are to be peacemakers everywhere we go. There's the foreign policy is going to be, what do you need?
Mm-hmm.
There's not going to be any need for things like border walls or things or anything like that. There's not going to be any need for an immigration law. There's not going to be any, all of these things that everybody says, well, a Christian nation should do this. when we actually look at what in Scripture is defined by a Christian nation, we end up with the church. We don't end up with a government.
Yeah.
That's why we can't do these things out. We have to look at the fruit of the Spirit and actually walk through them this way, is that not understanding what it means to actually be defined by the Spirit is part of what allows us to get into these big ideological, I was about to say theological, they're ideological
Yes.
ideas as far as what our purpose here actually is. But God's already told us what it is: to seek justice, love mercy, to walk humbly with God, because we are already made good in his sight. That is what this is all about. So Brandon's back for season 4 for at least today. I'm sure he'll be back throughout.
At some point.
We are slowly figuring out ways to make schedules work. Kind of, sure. So he still exists. We didn't throw him out. We were kind to him and we showed mercy to him, even in the midst of utter defeat in a lot of the things that we've done over the past few years.
It's Christmas.
Yes. So let us know what you think as far as if we completely screwed this up or got it right, or all of the above in some cases. Let us know what you think. Yeah, all the different channels at Ministry Misfit, you can find us. You can go to the website. I think we have the comment section up on there. It went down for a little bit because Wix was changing their system up. I think we got it fixed now. Also, again, patreon.com/Ministry Misfits. We are still going to finish the Daniel study. As hard as it's been for me to track Brandon down, it's been 100 times harder actually to track down Tamiko. So once Tamiko and I are able to get back together, we will finish the book of Daniel here eventually. And then the Galatian study, which deals with the chapters we just looked at, that one that Brandon and I did last summer is still up, or last spring actually, is still up there as well. You also occasionally get early releases for episodes. You get early access to blogs, different things like that. It is technically birthday month.
Yes.
Even though we haven't been able to advertise it as much as we wanted. Both Brandon and I's birthdays were in the past week or so. And so it's birthday month. If you want to celebrate birthday month with us, new Patreon supporters get a little birthday bonus as well. So if you join Patreon during the month of June, you'll get a little birthday bonus as a thank you from us, and to help celebrate all of the June
and it's
birthdays
not us
that we've
singing
got.
to you.
And it is definitely not us singing to you. We probably could. Tamiko probably could do it.
He'd be a lot better than
we could have Tamiko do it for you. If you want a birthday card from Tamiko, just let us know and we'll see if we can get him to sing you one. I actually haven't heard him sing like fully, just kind of in passing. So I don't know if that would be good.
Well, you
and lovely and beautiful,
bar, so it's fine.
Yeah, that's true. It's definitely going to be more goodly than if either of us had done it. And if you want to complain about the fact I've used the word goodly like 5 times today, then what do you expect? You should know I don't care about grammar. So anyway, we will see you all next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.